The city never sleeps, they say. But at 3 in the morning, even Los Angeles holds its breath. In a suite on the 14th floor of the Beverly Hills Hotel, the most photographed woman in the world sat alone before a typewriter. Marilyn Monroe, though that name felt like a costume she couldn't quite remove, stared at the blank page rolled into the machine. The paper was so white, it almost hurt to look at. She was not supposed to be here. She was supposed to be at the studio, smiling for cameras, reading lines someone else had written, being the fantasy everyone expected. But tonight, she had chosen differently. Tonight, she would write her own words. Her fingers hovered over the keys, like a pianist before the first note. Outside, palm trees swayed in a wind she couldn't feel through the sealed windows. Inside, the air conditioning hummed its mechanical lullaby. The room was too cold, but she didn't adjust the thermostat. The cold kept her awake. The cold reminded her she was real. On the nightstand sat a glass of water, 2 pills she hadn't taken, and a script for a movie she didn't want to make. Its title mocked her, The Girl Who Had Everything. She had laughed when they sent it, a bitter laugh that tasted like old champagne. But tonight was not about their scripts, tonight was about hers. She lit a cigarette, her 5th in the last hour, and watched the smoke curl toward the ceiling like a question mark. The ashtray was already full of lipstick-stained filters, her reflection caught in the window glass, a ghost of herself, translucent, layered over the city lights below. 2 women, always 2 women. Marilyn and Norma Jean, the star and the orphan, the fantasy and the truth. Which one was sitting here now? Which one was about to write? She thought about beginnings. Every script she had ever read started with a clear, confident line, an establishing shot, a hook. But how do you begin your own life? Where is the opening scene? She thought back, past the fame, past the photographers and studio lots and premiere lights, past the marriages and disappointments and small victories. Back to a little girl with mouse-brown hair and a crooked smile, standing outside an orphanage, watching other children get chosen while she remained. That little girl was still inside her, had always been inside her. No amount of platinum dye or red lipstick could erase her. Marilyn stubbed out her cigarette and placed her fingers on the keys. They were cold, everything was cold tonight, but she began to type. The unfinished script. By the woman you think you know. She stopped, read it back, deleted the last line, tried again. By Norma Jane Mortensen. Better, more honest, though that name felt almost as foreign as Marilyn Monroe now. She continued typing, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum. Fade in. Once there was a girl who learned very early that she was not enough to keep her mother sane, not enough to make her father stay, not enough to be chosen, to be kept, to be loved without conditions. So she decided to become someone else, someone who would be enough, someone who would be too much to ignore. She became a dream, and dreams, she learned, are easier to love than people. Marilyn stopped typing. Her heart was beating faster. This felt different. This felt true, not the facts, necessarily, but the truth beneath the facts, the emotional truth. But could she sustain it? Could she really excavate all the buried memories, examine all the painful moments, expose all the carefully hidden scars? The clock read 3:47 a.m. In a few hours, the phone would start ringing. Her agent, her publicist, the studio, everyone wanting something. Everyone needing Marilyn Monroe to be Marilyn Monroe. But right now, in this stolen pocket of night, she could be whoever she wanted. She could be the writer of her own story. She continued typing. The keys clacked in steady rhythm, a heartbeat, a pulse, proof of life. She wrote about the orphanage, about standing at windows, watching other children play, learning early that she was always on the outside looking in. She wrote about foster homes where she washed dishes with raw red hands while other children laughed in yards she wasn't allowed to enter. She wrote about her mother, beautiful and broken, and the childhood spent waiting for a rescue that never came. She wrote about the body that betrayed her at 15, developing curves that made men stare and women whisper, about learning that her body was both her greatest asset and her deepest curse. About the teacher who praised her essay on Gatsby and then looked at her chest, unable to separate her mind from her flesh. She wrote about marrying Jim Dougherty at 16, thinking marriage would save her, would make her real and legitimate. About the loneliness of that marriage, lonelier than the orphanage because at least then she'd had hope. About sitting at a kitchen table writing letters to no one, while her husband listened to war news in the other room, never really seeing her. She wrote about the defense factory where she inspected parachutes during the war. About the photographer who stopped, stared, and said 4 words that changed everything: "You've got something." About the business card he handed her, and the door it opened to a world where she could be someone. She wrote about Emmeline Snively's modeling agency, where she learned her first Hollywood lesson: you're never good enough as you are. You're always a project. Her hair was too dark, it needed to be platinum. Her smile was too genuine, it needed to be sultry. Her posture was too humble, it needed to be confident. She was raw material that needed polish, lots of polish. She wrote about the transformation. The hair salon where chemicals burned her scalp as her dark hair turned golden, then platinum. The photography studios where she learned to arch her back, lower her chin, smolder with her eyes. The dance classes where she practiced walking in heels with books balanced on her head. The slow, methodical erasure of Norma Jean and the construction of Marilyn Monroe. And then she wrote about the price. Her fingers slowed on the keys. This was the dangerous part. The part she had never told anyone. The part that would destroy her if it ever became public. But wasn't that the point of this? To tell the truth? All of it? She took a deep breath and continued. She wrote about the casting couches, about the private dinners with men who held her career in their sweating palms, about the calculations she made. This one can actually help me. This one is just a creep. This one might be dangerous. About the lines she drew and the lines she crossed, hating herself but doing it anyway because the alternative was unthinkable, going back to the factory, back to obscurity, back to being nobody. She wrote, "I am not sorry. Or maybe I am sorry, but not for the reasons you think. I'm sorry it was necessary. I'm sorry the system was designed that way. I'm sorry my body was the only currency I had. But I'm not sorry I did what I had to do to survive. I'd rather be a whore with a career than a saint with nothing." The words stared back at her from the page, stark and unforgiving. If anyone ever read this, they would crucify her. But maybe being destroyed for telling the truth was better than being celebrated for living a lie. She wrote about her first studio contract at Fox, $75 a week to be a starlet, whatever that meant. About the small roles, the bit parts, the scenes where she walked through frame looking decorative while men delivered the important lines. About being told she couldn't act, couldn't deliver dialogue, was just a pretty face. She wrote about proving them wrong, about studying with Natasha Lytis, with Lee Strasberg, working harder than anyone knew, about the roles that finally showcased her talent. Niagara, Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, How to Marry a Millionaire. About the moment she realized she had become exactly what she set out to become, a star. And about the hollowness of that achievement, because in becoming Marilyn Monroe, she had killed Norma Jean, and now she was trapped inside a creation of her own making, unable to escape the image she had so carefully constructed. She wrote about Joe DiMaggio, who loved Marilyn but hated what she represented, about the marriage that failed because he wanted a housewife and she was a star, and those two things could not coexist. About standing over a subway grate in a white dress while thousands watched and cameras rolled, and seeing Joe's face in the crowd, angry, humiliated, possessive, and knowing in that moment the marriage was over. She wrote about Arthur Miller, the intellectual playwright who was supposed to save her, to see past Marilyn to Norma Jane beneath. About how he had written about her with such contempt in his journals, calling her a disappointment, and how reading those words had broken something inside her that never quite healed. About the baby she lost and the grief that swallowed her whole. She wrote about the pills, the ones to help her sleep and the ones to wake her up and the ones to get through the day. About the doctors who prescribed them and the studios that demanded she take them because the show must go on and Marilyn Monroe must always be Marilyn Monroe, no matter what Norma Jean was feeling. She wrote about the loneliness, the crushing, suffocating loneliness of being the most famous woman in the world and having no one who truly knew her, about being surrounded by people, agents, publicists, assistants, hangers-on, and feeling utterly alone, about the difference between being seen and being known, and how she had spent her entire life being seen but never known. Dawn was breaking when she finally stopped typing. Her fingers ached, her eyes burned. The ashtray overflowed with cigarette butts. The coffee had gone cold hours ago. She carefully removed the pages from the typewriter and counted them. 43 pages, 43 pages of her life, her truth, her story, written in her own words. She read through them slowly, critically. Some sections made her cringe, too melodramatic, too self-pitying. But other sections surprised her with their honesty, their insight, their raw emotional power. This was not the sanitized studio biography. This was not the gossip column speculation. This was her story, messy and complicated and true. But it was also unfinished. She had barely scratched the surface. There was so much more to tell about her recent films, her battles with the studios, her dreams of being taken seriously as an actress, her fears about aging and irrelevance in an industry that worshipped youth. And she didn't know how to end it. How do you end your own life story when you're still living it, when you don't know what comes next? Maybe that was the point. Maybe some stories aren't meant to be finished. Maybe the power is in the unfinishedness, in refusing to provide a neat conclusion, in staying open-ended and undefined. She gathered the pages carefully and placed them in the nightstand drawer, locked it, put the key in her purse. Then she stood at the window and watched the sun rise over Los Angeles. The city was waking up, cars beginning to fill the streets, lights coming on in windows, the machinery of Hollywood grinding back to life. Soon, the phone would ring. Soon she would have to be Marilyn Monroe again. Soon she would have to put on the costume, apply the makeup, perform the role everyone expected. But for now, in this quiet moment between night and day, she was just a woman who had written her truth, a woman who had reclaimed her own narrative, even if no one ever read it. She thought about the pages in the drawer. What would she do with them? She couldn't publish them. They were too raw, too honest, too dangerous. The studio would sue her. The press would destroy her. Her career would be over. But maybe that was okay. Maybe the point wasn't publication. Maybe the point was simply the act of writing itself. The act of bearing witness to her own life. The act of saying, I was here. I existed. I was more than the image you created. Over the next 5 days, she returned to the typewriter whenever she could steal time. Between studio obligations and photo shoots and interviews, she wrote. Late at night when the pills wouldn't let her sleep, she wrote. Early in the morning before the phone started ringing, she wrote. She wrote about her dreams, not the Hollywood dreams of fame and fortune, but her real dreams, about wanting to be taken seriously as an actress, about wanting to play Grushenka in The Brothers Karamazov, about wanting to prove she was more than just a sex symbol, more than just a dumb blonde, more than just a fantasy. She wrote about her fears of aging, of being replaced by younger, prettier girls, of being forgotten, of dying alone and unloved, about the panic attacks that seized her before going on set, about the crushing self-doubt that whispered she was a fraud and everyone would soon realize it. She wrote about the moments of joy too, the rare times when everything clicked and she delivered a performance that felt true and real. The fan letters from soldiers overseas who said her movies gave them hope. The little girl who had approached her on the street and said, "You're so beautiful," with such pure, uncomplicated admiration that it had made her cry. She wrote about her complicated relationship with her own image, how she had created Marilyn Monroe deliberately, carefully, as an act of self-invention, how that creation had given her power and agency in a world that wanted to control her, but also how that creation had become a prison, trapping her inside a persona she could never escape. She wrote about the male gaze, how her entire career had been built on it, how she had learned to manipulate it, to use it to her advantage, but also how exhausting it was to always be looked at, evaluated, objectified. How she sometimes wanted to scream, "I'm a person. I have thoughts and feelings and dreams. I'm more than just a body." She wrote about other women in Hollywood, about the competition and cattiness the studios encouraged, pitting women against each other for roles, for attention, for the approval of powerful men, but also about the quiet solidarity, the shared understanding of what it meant to navigate this industry as a woman, about the actresses who had helped her, mentored her, shown her kindness when they didn't have to. She wrote about power, who had it, who didn't, and how it shaped every interaction in Hollywood. About the studio executives who could make or break careers with a phone call. About the directors who treated actresses like props. About the gossip columnists who could destroy reputations with a single item. And about her own growing power as a box office draw, and how even that power was limited, conditional, always at risk of being taken away. On the 7th day, she sat before the typewriter and realized she didn't know what else to write. Not because she had run out of story, her life was far from over, but because she had said what she needed to say. She had borne witness to her own existence. She had claimed her own narrative. The manuscript was over 200 pages now. 200 pages of truth and memory and pain and hope. 200 pages that no one might ever read. She typed one final passage. Fade out. This is an unfinished script because I am an unfinished person. I am still becoming, still changing, still trying to figure out who I am beneath all the layers of image and expectation. Maybe Marilyn Monroe was my greatest role. Maybe she was my biggest mistake. Maybe she was both. Maybe the truth is always more complicated than the stories we tell. I don't know how this story ends. I don't know if Norma Jane and Marilyn can ever be reconciled, or if I'll spend the rest of my life split between them. I don't know if I'll ever be taken seriously as an actress, or if I'll always be just the blonde bombshell, the sex symbol, the fantasy. But I know this. I existed. I was here. I was more than what you saw on screen. I was a real person with real feelings and real dreams and real pain. And I wrote my own story. Even if no one ever reads it, I wrote it. In my own words. On my own terms. That has to count for something. That has to be enough. The end, or maybe just the beginning. Marilyn removed the final page from the typewriter. She stacked all the pages carefully, tapped them into alignment, and placed them in a manila envelope. She sealed it and wrote on the outside, in her careful handwriting, "The Unfinished Script by Norma Jean." Then she placed the envelope in the bottom of her suitcase, beneath clothes and shoes and makeup cases, hidden but not destroyed, secret but not erased. She didn't know what would become of it. Maybe someday when she was braver or more desperate or simply ready, she would show it to someone. Or maybe it would remain hidden forever, a secret story for an audience of one. But it existed. That was what mattered. Her truth existed, written in her own hand, told in her own voice. She had reclaimed her narrative. She had proven, if only to herself, that she was more than the image, that Norma Jean still lived beneath the Monroe mask. And for now, that was enough. Epilogue. The phone rang. Marilyn took a deep breath, put on her brightest smile, even though no one could see it, and answered in that breathy little girl voice everyone expected. "Hello?" "Marilyn, finally. We've been trying to reach you all morning. You're needed on set in an hour. Can you make it?" She looked at the suitcase where her manuscript lay hidden. Then she looked at her reflection in the mirror, platinum hair, red lips, the face that had launched 1,000 fantasies. "Of course," she said. "I'll be there. I'm always there." She hung up and began the transformation. Applied the makeup, styled the hair, put on the costume, became Marilyn Monroe once more. But something was different now. She carried a secret. She had written her truth, and that truth existed somewhere beyond the image, beyond the performance, beyond the fantasy. She was more than what they saw. She had proven it, and no one could take that away from her. As she left the hotel room, she glanced back one last time at the typewriter sitting on the desk. It looked ordinary, unremarkable, but it had been her instrument of rebellion, her tool of self-reclamation. She smiled, a real smile, not the Marilyn smile, and closed the door behind her. The unfinished script remained, waiting in darkness, holding its secrets, bearing witness to a life that was so much more than anyone knew.